Tara Bicknell, and I've been asked by the Chilkat Valley Mining Forum Committee to help host and moderate this afternoon. Thanks for being here. Just some background, the event's organized by the Chilkat Valley Mining Forum Committee, whose mission it is to organize public information forums that provide quality information and dialogue on mining topics of interest to communities of Haines and Klukwan, and relevant to mineral exploration and mining work being conducted in the valley. The forum committees met 12 times since August to plan this event that you're here at tonight, discussing and debating details like content and theme, format, venue, dates, fundraising, and perhaps most importantly, which speakers to invite. The speaker selection process involves nomination by a committee member, discussion of the speaker's experience, and finally, a formal vote to approve an invitation. The details of that process are described in a terms of reference document that you can find in the back of the room if you guys want to know more about that. It's on that front table. Can you raise a hand back there where it is? Great. First, you've got a hand up if you guys want to see those. And the committee consists of 9 local groups and organizations interested in the discussion of mining in the valley. Members who helped organize today's event include, and if you guys could stand up as I call your name, the Alaska Miners Association Haines Chapter, Mike Makoviak, who's already standing back there, and Diana Labin, who's in the back. There we go. Great. Chilkat Indian Association, we have Luke Williams and James Hart. Constantine Mining, Liz Cornejo, there she is, and Sherry Moss. The Haynesboro, Jan Hill, I know she's here, there she is, and Brad Ryan. Okay. Haines Chamber of Commerce, Tracy Harmon, and Jerry Lapp. There. Hi, Jerry. Haines Sportsmen's Association, Haines Farmay, and Sue Jason. Great. Northern Southeast Gill Netters, Ryan Cook, and Marty Smith. Okay. Tuxtonic Watershed Council, Ben Kirkpatrick, and Norm Hughes. Don't see them. And the Palmer family, Jesse Badger. Guys, come on in, grab a seat. If we need more seats, we'll pull some from the front and get you all seated. Thanks for being here. Thanks for helping with chairs in the back, guys. Also, the Haines Economic Development Council and the United Southeast Alaska Gill Netters also have asked to join the committee in March. So they'll be welcomed by the committee and be participating in the future. If you guys know of an organization or if you're part of one that wants to join the committee, you can contact any of those people you just saw stand up and learn more about joining that forum to help plan the next forum. There'll be some time afterwards to chat with those folks if you want to do that. This tonight is the 3rd forum the committee's organized since forming in 2017. The first forum was a 2-day event in October 2017 that included speakers on a broad spectrum of topics. The second one was in April 2018, and that focused on water quality regulations and studies. And today's forum is designed to explore the theme of community impacts and solutions related to the general topic of mining. And note that the committee members do not necessarily endorse the opinions of each speaker today, but members have worked hard to find quality speakers with valuable information to share with you and to stimulate our local community discussions. Once again, I'm Tara Bicknell. I'm here to moderate. That's my only title, which is probably why I'm moderating tonight. So, glad to be here. A couple of housekeeping notes. You'll want to know where the bathrooms are if you don't already. Right through this door right here and to your right are both women's and men's. There's also more downstairs. If you go through here, there's a stairwell that will take you right down to some other bathrooms. And there's also an exit to the outside that way. Be polite, put your phones on silent if you don't mind. And that's just a good reminder whether you're watching a movie or here at the event. Thanks. The format for today will be It's a 3-hour allotment that there is for today. There's 3 presentations, roughly 30 minutes each, and then there'll be a short refreshment break before we go into a Q&A and a discussion after that. You'll see there's a camera back here. The event is being filmed and will be posted to the committee Facebook site for future use and for those who were unable to attend today. And KHNS Radio and Chilkat Valley News are also here to cover the event. All right, let's get into who we've got here today. We have 3 speakers lined up for today. Lance Miller, he's Vice President, Natural Resources, NANA Corporation, and he'll be starting out today, but I'll go ahead and let you know who else we have. Shena, Socio-Community Specialist with Hemmera Consulting, and Jodi Mitchell, and she's CEO of IPEC and a Sealaska board member. I'll tell you a little bit more about each one as they get ready to come up and speak, but we'll start with Lance. I will go ahead and say that there will be a Q&A following all 3 speakers. So if you guys can, if you need to note down any questions you have for the end, we'll just save them all for after everyone's had a chance to speak. And then we'll have one giant Q&A session. How about that? There'll be a break after everyone speaks, and then we'll go into that Q&A. Well, I think it's time to introduce Lance Miller. He is with NANA Corporation, and he's worked for over 30 years in the minerals industry and the economic development sector. He's the chairman of the Alaska Minerals Commission and an executive board member of the Resource Development Council. He's also a member of the Alaska Climate Impact Assessment Commission, and he holds a PhD in economic and structural geology from the University of Arizona. And he's currently vice president of natural resources for NANA Regional Corporation. Welcome, Lance.
All right, thank you. Do I need this? Yes, okay. All right, well, it's a pleasure being here. So I have a timer so I don't go on too long. Liz says we could just do whatever, but I think, trying to keep it less than a couple hours each. But actually flying up here was pretty cool. I did feel, I live in Anchorage now. I have worked various mining projects around the world, but I actually spent a lot of my formative years from when I was about 2 years old up on the Juneau ice field. And the flight today, we got to fly right by pretty close to Taku Towers, ahead of the Gilkey and over. So it was pretty neat to see all that country again. And that was on the Juneau Icefield Research Program that my folks started some, 70 years ago or something. So what I want to do today is just give some perspectives and food for thought. And this is an interesting slide from the National Academy of Medicine. If we think about social and economic factors, as it says on health, and physical environment is important. I mean, there's pollutants, there's things out there. But if you really look at a healthy lifestyle, the physical environment, they figure is 10%, but social and economic factors, which include education, employment, income, so jobs, your community, family support, is really significant here. And I think that's interesting. Clinical care, of course, is important, and what you do with your own time is important as well. Next slide, please. Now, this one, the next 2 slides here, and I don't think it's too out of touch because Southeast is on here, but this came up in the NANA region when people are like, oh, someone has a friend who got cancer and there's high cancer incidence rates and so forth. So I did a little research, and if you look at this, at least in Northwest Alaska, it has some of the lowest cancer incident rates in the whole state, which I think is kind of fascinating. So the takeaway here in the next slide is we hear a lot of innuendos and we all have personal experiences, but it's important to look at data. Next slide, please. Similar slide talking about cancer mortality. And again, Northwest Alaska and Yukon-Kuskokwim area actually is pretty low. And Again, there might be a lot of reasons for this. You know, who knows exactly who's reporting and how they're tracking the data. However, this is from ANTHC, basically, so there is a pretty good database for this information. Again, you know, you can take a lot of different interpretations, but I think this was one of the ones for the part of the world I work in, where it's actually the data says something different than a lot of what people think. Next slide. This one is another one. This is way out of my league, right? I'm a geologist, so this is diving into biology and health. But this is it's kind of fun. A recent study from the Journal of American Medical Association. And what this is showing is if you were born, so between 1980 and 2014, the change if you were born in these areas for life expectancy. Okay. And again, I'm just being very provincial looking at Northwest Alaska. And it's interesting, Red Dog Mine came along in the mid-late 80s. Yeah. Nah, that's okay. Thanks, so. And oil in the North Slope, of course. And if you look at this, and it says down there in the bottom, that areas on a national average, the counties that have seen the biggest increase are the coasts, of course, central Colorado, and then northern Northwest Alaska, which is kind of fascinating. And, you know, some ideas that I've thought about for that is basically there has been greater education, there's been greater employment, there's actually also been greater access to health care. Remember in the first slide, that's an important aspect as well as the clinical side of it. So just some interesting things to think about. And also if you're going to look to move somewhere in the country, you can use this map of where to go and where not to go. All right, now a couple slides on some experience in Juneau. Sorry about the lousy colors up there. But I was thinking about it, and you know, there's actually been mining in Juneau for over 140 years, which is kind of a long time. So we say, oh, mining's a short-term thing. Is it sustainable? Well, depends on your definition of sustainability. But this is, of course, a picture of the AJ mill before the area was filled in with the waste rock from the mine. Actually, they're taking some just to dump out in the channel, filling in. So I don't know when this would have been, probably in the 40s or something like that. And for disclosure, I did work at Echo Bay and the AJ project back in the late 80s and early 90s. And that's another interesting thing I've seen with the change of attitudes toward mining in Juneau then, when there was some pretty amazing things said in public meetings about those stupid miners, to today, when mining actually is, you know, the largest taxpayer in Juneau and is a part of the economy. But the takeaway of this is deposits, once you're in a mineralized area, if it's done correctly, these areas last for a long time. Next. And then I think this is a story I think people in Juneau know, but I was just talking to some even people in industry in Anchorage recently who didn't maybe fully appreciate it, that of course Juneau has some of the lowest, I believe, electrical rates, kept nodding, in the state. That started with the hydropower that came out of the AJ and Treadwell, well, AJ and Perseverance mines, so Salmon Creek, Annex Lake. When the mines shut down, they turned it into the power company, which was AEL&P. So that came right out of the mines. Then when Lake Dorothy was built, one of the things that helped get that over the economic hurdle was that Greens Creek took on the excess power, which one helped reduce, you know, fossil fuel emission from Greens Creek, but also because they bought the interruptible power, then there was some cash to help finance essentially the project. So, you know, here almost 100 years later, the growth or sustainability of hydropower, renewable power in Juneau was because of mining. Certainly. Okay. Now a couple slides to talk about the north, and sorry about my graphics here. This is actually pretty recent because I was speaking in Kotzebue, and I was asking Willie Hensley, who folks probably have heard of, some of him, he's a pretty well-known Native leader, about, when Nana was first looking at Red Dog, what was sort of the vision out there? And he goes, well, I found this paper that he gave in 1990 at the 7th Inuit Studies Conference. So he took pictures on his phone and texted it to me, and I just cut and pasted. But what's pretty neat is, well, first of all, I'll just summarize this sort of section of text. But I like what he says there, is as Alaska Natives look to the future and be certain that someone will take care of us, the way he sees it in. But it won't be the government, the churches, or private industry. It will be us. And I think maybe an application to what's, to Haynes is, as we're looking ahead, look at what's going on with the budget, cut back in state services. When communities have an opportunity to basically be a little bit more independent for jobs, for finances, it's just an opportunity, I guess, leave it at that. And then with those opportunities, you can take with what you may, and some people choose not to take advantage of them. In the case of Nana, they were pretty much, well, they didn't know mining. Late 70s was a long time ago, especially, in that part of the world, there's a lot of exploration, but not mining. Willie and some of the early leaders of Nana went to all the villages and educated the shareholders about it, and then took a vote. And as you can see here, they voted approved the idea of mineral development with certain conditions: shareholder employment, environmental control, subsistence, and that there be a cash return to Nana. So it was really about the future, and it was really about jobs and jobs for future generations, for their kids, their grandchildren, and so forth. Next, please. This is just a picture of the Red Dog looking across the tailings pond, and that's really the whole footprint from the personal accommodation center to the water treatment, the mill, the mine is just back over there, and you're looking to the north, the Brooks Range, of course, in the background. So just a couple little examples of Red Dog. And one of the things that they've been able to do is along the DMTS, the Long Mountain Transportation System, 52-mile road from Chukchi to the mine, is fuel gets hauled along and dropped. There's a point along the road where villagers from Noatak, which is about 430 people on the Noatak River, can come over and buy fuel at cost, which, depending on the year, I think last year was under $4 a gallon. Why that's important is because Noatak, with the shallowing of the river there, they can't get barges in anymore. So fuel is at least $9 a gallon. And several of the villages in the Nana region, it's up on the order of $10, $11 a gallon, so it has to be flown in. So this affords opportunity to come over to the snow machine, buy it from the mine, mine at cost, and take it back. And we're actually looking at building a gravel road, all-weather road, over here from the village, which is another interesting thing, how attitudes up there have changed about roads and access and things to some of this infrastructure. And it's really about, in that case, survival. I mean, if you want to keep people in the villages and have jobs, you need some economic engine. So, thanks. So this slide is kind of a lot here, but I'd just like to highlight, not the top one, but the next one. So there's the section of ANCSA called 7I, where, for those of you who don't know, 70% of the net proceeds are distributed to all other ANCs, and through 7I and 7J, then down to Village Corps. Through last year, our fiscal year 18, Nana has distributed $1.2 billion throughout Alaska, from Heidelberg to Nuiqsut, so it's pretty amazing what the reach. Now, that's not to say that, of course, the project here would do that, because it's not native land. However, it's still federal, and there's the Alaska Mental Health Trust, so there are beneficiaries to any of these developments. And then ADA and the bottom one over here, payment in lieu of taxes to the Northwest Arctic Borough. Red Dog is about 90% of the base funding for the budget for the Northwest Arctic Borough. A lot of jobs, those are direct jobs, about 55% shareholder hire, and as you can see, over $43 million in wages. Next, please. So another thing really important, a lot of people eat caribou up in Northwest, and we want to make sure that they're not impeded by, that's the Long Mountain Transportation System Road. Of course, picture a caribou with the mine in the background. There's a subsistence committee, which is made up of people from Kivalina and Noatak, and they put in various regulations for, we shut down trucking if caribou are within so far of a truck. They approved the beginning of the shipping season when you start shipping concentrate out to the smelters, and that's based on when the end of marine mammal hunting is. So it's a very active committee. If there's any issue, a spill or anything, they're right there engaged and involved. So a few little economic factoids, and this data is a little old, but the trends are still the same, and we are updating it. And self-explanatory here, how the wages compared to other wages in the Northwest Arctic Borough or Alaska. Today, I think the average is about, it's statewide and about the same for Red Dog, about $107,000 a year. Next. So, just a few sort of points about a 25-year-old, as you can see, are living in Northwest Arctic Borough today. And this was done, we did a big study for the 25th anniversary of Red Dog. And we actually compared it to what used to be called Wade Hampton. I think it's the lower, or the Kuskokwim, Yukon area. And then there's two other rural areas. And clearly the Northwest Arctic Borough is way ahead, but we actually didn't want to compare them because you don't like to compare and contrast too much with your neighbors. But it really is because of the income, the access to services, and to jobs. We do have the case where people, shareholders work at the mine and do move to the Matsu area. A lot of them live in the Anchorage Bowl, but then move back. There's still roughly 200 at least folks who work at the mine who live in the villages, and that's huge. That's tens of millions of dollars. And we all know how those dollars get spread around to the rest of the family and friends too. So it really has made a difference in the region as far as village life. But looking ahead, we're still concerned about viability and how long will mining last. And there's great opportunity in the Red Dog District, but still, that is always a concern. Let's see what else to say on that. Yeah, I think that's enough. There is a recent, there's another one I can point you to too. Bob Luffler with ICER at UAA did a paper a few years ago on Red Dog, and you can find that online. It has a lot of good socioeconomic information. And he's just completing another one, which the data isn't out, so I don't have it, but it's really interesting. He was telling me if men and women who have worked in mining, after they've left the job, what's their chance of keeping the same level of wage? And often it's very close, obviously not as high, but still it's significantly higher. Even if they go to a job in the school or at the village or an IRA, because of the skills they've gained in mining, that you can keep a very competitive salary, and basically you have skills that are very transferable. The other thing that we've really seen too is just the safety training that people get in healthy living working at the mine has made a big difference for folks back in the communities and the villages. If someone has a heart attack or if there's a fire, more people actually know what to do in those events. So that's kind of cool. Another aspect that I'm pretty interested in is trying to replace, all of us, myself, trying to get the next generation involved with STEM. One thing I've always heard at NANA is, we want a NANA shareholder to be the next general manager of Red Dog, and that's not going to happen if they're driving truck. exactly, and that took a while for people to understand that. You really do need to go the professional route. There's great examples. This GeoForce program, those kids are all from the NANA region. We have 3 graduating high school this year, and 2 of the 3 are going to go to college and going into geoscience, actually. NSEP is a good one. Also, we work with Alaska Resource Education. This was a little project we did in Kivalina, just water sampling with some of the students. So you have to, I think to get here though, you really need the role models. And this is also a challenge in mining when if you have a good record, you're clean, you come out of high school, in a few years you can be making really good money working at the mine at 3 and 2 or 2 and 2 schedule, and then why go to college and work, make less than your buddy who's driving trucks. But that's why you have to care about science and math. It may not make economic sense right away, but in the long term it does. So the last couple slides here, just want to talk about time. And I know talking to Liz, she's, some people have brought this up around here. This is a bit of a busy graph. And then we added the people down there just to show how these things go. I actually did have an older person at the end, but figured maybe I didn't want to do that, so we took that off. But these different phases, I think people think, gosh, a company's been around for 10 years and spent tens of millions of dollars, and it's a mine. I mean, we've had that issue in the NANA region at this project called Bornite. Like, well, where are they sending the ore? Well, we're not even mining yet. These stages, while it says time a few years, I mean, that can be 50, 60 years, right? And so to get to construction is sometimes a bit of a crapshoot. I hate to say it. But also you need, everything has to be aligned. And I think as a community, you also have to realize just because you want it or don't want it, there's other factors. There's the financial markets, there's the metal prices, there's in Alaska, the seasonality of summer exploration adds a lot of time to projects. You get all these things, and to get them all aligned and coalesced, eventually, if things work out, a project might be a producing mine. But Alaska is fraught with a lot more projects that haven't happened than have happened. So maybe a message from some of this is it takes a lot of work, both from those, the proponents, the company and so forth, but also communities. If you want it to be a piece of the future that helps the community, these things just don't happen. Sometimes people say, I remember we went around on some village visits in the NANA region for OCS when that was happening, to get a pulse from the villages, were they okay with it? And a lot of people were like, well, it's just going to happen, we can't do anything about it. Well, you can do something about it, and also it just won't happen. And look what happened with OCS, right? Shell, $7 billion. And some say, well, it was a permitting thing, but really it also comes back to the geology, the engineering, the technical aspects. It just, the prize wasn't big enough there. So again, I think to take any one thing, you have to look at projects very holistically. Short story is they take a long time and cost a whole bunch of money. So this one put together, and you can see some of these projects near, AJ, Rock Creek up by Nome, UKMP is an Ambler district in our region, Pebble project, Donlin, Live and Good. I didn't put Palmer project, Constantine on here. Mines in production, there's just 5 metal mines. And to get there, in Alaska, it is about 16 years average and $300 million to get to a go, no-go decision. That will depend on the size of the project. A lot of these were larger projects, sort of larger. But that is the kind of time and money it takes from really almost a rediscovery to a decision. Because in the case of Kensington, Echo Bay, there is a lot of opportunity. And it's all how you want to embrace it. other villages in northwest Alaska, and those are in the lower right, actually the concentrate storage sheds, looking out the Chuck Sea and one of the probably a 50,000 ton handy ship taking concentrate someplace in Asia or Canada. Okay. That's it.
Lance Miller, Nana Corporation. And like I mentioned earlier, just note down your questions for the Q&A session that's going to follow all three speakers. If you need to jot something down, go for it. How are we doing on seating? Does anyone need another seat set up? We can set up another row over here maybe. We have more seats we can use. Mike, if you could help me with that, that'd be great. Cool. How about, are you guys hearing okay? Everyone hearing okay? Okay, awesome. Well, let's introduce our next speaker. We have Jodi Mitchell coming up next, and she's born in Juneau. She has a Bachelor of Science degree in Finance, and she's the Chief Executive Officer of Inside Passage Electro Cooperative, known as IPEC as you guys know it. And she began her career at the nonprofit member-owned cooperative in 1993. Jodi's the Vice Chair of the Board of Sealaska Corporation and has been a member of the board since 2006. Welcome, Jodi.
Thanks, Carla. Well, I'm not really going to be talking about mining. I may more be talking about what I have witnessed as the community of Hoona embraced the Icy Strait Point tourism destination, just as a way of showing how they cope with all the changes that came. So, next slide, please. I think everybody here knows where Hoona is, but just in case, I've got a picture. And then that picture on the right there is the Garchina Falls, now it's a hydro project, but back then it was just a falls. So Hoona is usually around 750, 800 people, and then in the summertime it balloons by about 200 or more people. In the late 90s, Hoona Totem, the AXA Corporation for Hoona, made plans to develop the old cannery site there at Icy Strait Point near Hoona. And, again, the plan was to construct a tourist destination resort to provide jobs, commerce, and economic development for the community, as well as profits for Hoona Totem. I just wrote this morning on the ferry, so. And I don't have nearly as many pictures as Lance did, but hopefully I won't put you all to sleep. Before the ISP development started, the primary industries were logging and fishing. And then when the timber harvest ended, they pretty much ran out of timber in the early 2000s, leaving many residents without employment. And then fishing had become less profitable due to steep increases in fuel. You all went through all that, so you remember how it was and still is. And then now we have less certainty about fish stocks. Many in the community knew something needed to happen to keep the community from just folding. And you can see the dramatic difference. The IPEC serves Angoon, Hoona, Cake, Plukwan, and the Chilkat Valley. And having ISP in Hoona, they are at least double the size of the other communities because they have that great source of employment and economic development. Next slide, please. So Hoona was at a turning point. Doing nothing was not an option. So community leaders needed to plan to keep the town viable. And so Hoona Totem worked with a local investor to develop the old cannery site. I don't know if any of you been out there to see it? Yeah, rode the zip line, yeah. So the idea was to renovate it to show how the old canneries looked, and some of us, even myself, spent a lot of time in canneries when I was a kid. We used to go out to Hawk Inlet, in fact, when I was a kid, and so it was pretty fascinating to see and kind of remember, and even the smells and everything, and how it was back in the days. So, I personally didn't think it was going to be that great of a deal because I'd been to canneries before, but wow, was it an attraction for people outside of the state. The plans, of course, were met with a lot of local skepticism and backlash. One of the investors was especially abrasive and talked down to the people, and eventually he was bought out by Huna Totem, and then things got better. But an important thing is to involve locals in decision making, which is of course why these meetings are taking place, and to communicate frequently to keep everyone on the same page. So fast forward to 2019, ISB is a thriving, successful, and growing business. They have a zip line, restaurant and bar, shops, new cruise ships, dock, and evidently a second one on the way. So it's definitely growing. Next slide, please. So in order to kind of, to provide some kind of good content for you all, I made a list of 15 questions and asked people that I knew in Huna to answer them, and interviewed and just took copious notes while I was on vacation. In rainy Arizona, go figure. So one of the first ones was, what's your overall feelings about or toward ISP? What's your perception? And of course there was good and bad. One said good, they're always improving, good for the community, great, good community partners, locally operated, and work together with the city of Huna. So those are all good things. And then number two, what's so good about it? Well, it brought life to the town, new businesses and opportunities for the young people and students and adults. Provides local jobs, and from other Southeast Alaska communities, people come in like from Mangoon and Kate, they go to Huna and work for the summer. And they have really good local hire statistics. Next slide. What's bad about it? Sometimes they don't do what they say they're going to do for their employees, and not enough employee appreciation. Well, everybody says that about their job, right? Not enough local training, dependent on outsiders, especially for the highly paid positions. Again, you gotta, just like Lance was talking about, you're gonna want to educate your youngsters so they can get those high-paying jobs and not have to be the truck driver unless they want to. And then they have lots of employee turnover. If you lose your whole bonus for the summer if you miss one day of work, so they're pretty strict about that, and people complain about that. And then, of course, drug testing makes it hard for some people to get hired, but there's plenty of ancillary work for those, I suppose. And then they have, thousands of tourists walking through town this summer, and sometimes they have traffic issues. They had some kind of a bike tour, I think it was last summer, and it caused traffic jams in the town, as you can imagine. Like 40 bikes going through the little town of Huna and stopping everywhere, and so anyway, it was disruptive. Next slide. How did you originally feel about ISD? Disbelief, concerns over sharing the town and services with tourists and outsiders, doubts, oh, you can't do that, what are you doing? You're just gonna waste a bunch of money. And then there were people who were just excited. One person said, I was a fan of the idea since the beginning because I could see that we need to do something post-logging. And good, could see the potential. Next slide. Have your feelings toward ISP changed since the beginning? Yes, the town has grown with more opportunities for new businesses. Someone said about the same. Lots of naysayers and doubters at first, but now almost everyone. In fact, I didn't interview anyone that actually hated it. There was a lot of people who couldn't give it or take it or leave it, but most everybody was overwhelmingly in support of it. What could they or should have they have done differently? Again, trying to look for the good, bad, and the ugly. The healthcare sector of Huna wasn't prepared at first for the increased demands of having all the elderly tourists coming and having heart attacks and things like they do, and just so they had to kind of get around that and learn really quick. Some said they should have involved the locals more in the beginning. Communication is key, so all stakeholders are listened to. Value the employees more, make them feel good about their work and their job and their contributions. And at first, some people's opinion was that Huna Totem wanted to keep all of the tourists down there at ISP. They didn't want them going through town and spending money somewhere else. Oh no, they wanted all their money spent there. And there was a lot of objections to that because there were little little budding businesses in town that wanted to get some of those tourist dollars, and so they were like, well, if they're going to come to my town, I want them to buy my stuff too. So it took a while for them to kind of straighten that out, and it seems like everybody's happy about that now. One of the people said they needed a really good, effective communicator from the outset. And like I said before, the first one spoke down to the locals. And they didn't anticipate the large investments in infrastructure that would be required. Of course, a lot of that is paid for with head taxes and whatnot, so it's not really an issue. But I was told they need an $11.9 million wastewater plant. So that's, but they didn't seem to be concerned about where the money was going to come from. That wasn't a concern, so next slide. How is local hire worked out? Very good. They said 75 to 80% of the jobs go to locals first before they look to outsiders. Again, people said they needed more training so they could get the better jobs. And there's lots of CDLs in town now to drive the buses, and so a lot of people got that training, which is good. And one person said, anyone who wants to work and get a job, as long as they can pass the drug test and be reliable. How has Shena dealt with the boom bust cycle of seasonal employment? More summer residents leave after the season is over. Some concerns over ISP going away altogether now that they've, the golden goose, they wanted to leave now. Some of them didn't want it, but now they're afraid it will go away. The city hires a couple extra people to help with trash collection and septic tanks and things like that during the summer. I was surprised by this. I asked, did you see any uptick in crime with having all the new people, transient folks come into town? Everybody said no. It was all the same as it had been. There's always been, there's always bad actors everywhere, but they know who they are and what to expect, so they don't worry about it. Was there organized local opposition? Yes. But most approve of it now that they see all the benefits. Lots of people complained to the city at first, but the city said that's not our land, we can't do anything about it. Lots of concerns about Huna being like Skagway. I hope nobody hears from Skagway, because I don't mean that as a derogatory thing, but what they meant was, they don't want to have, boom and bust, like, Skagway's like a ghost town in the winter. That's what they didn't want that. But now that they have it, they actually like it. Because they, it's like, it's a temporary thing. They know that it's going to go away. And, they think we're only here for the summer and then they're gone and then we have our town back. I mean, with the mine, of course, that's not the same, but just thought that was kind of funny. And then there are, of course, concerns over the cruise ships buying out the town. No one has any property anymore because the cruise ships own all of us. Well, were the outcomes different than what you expected? Yes. Because, of course, there were a lot of doubters that didn't want it at first. But then they exceeded expectations. Number of ships continues to increase along with new businesses. They have fishing charters, bear watching. The local bar now, where all the locals are, has a crab feed on cruise ship days, and so that's a real popular thing with all the locals. Cultural tours, they have, they've been doing a lot of carving, native carving, traditional carving, and so the tourists really love that, so they come and check that out. Increasing sales in all the existing businesses that were there before. People said it was better than expected, and wow, it keeps getting better every year. And then, of course, community volunteers help with the medical issues that they were having with aging passengers that come in. Next slide. What lessons were learned? More permanent infrastructure is needed and desirable, like public restrooms. In fact, I think they put some in. Of course, they built sidewalks and things so that people could walk from ISB. I don't know if you've been there before. It used to not have power out there or water or anything. So you'd have to, it was like, I think it's a mile or, I don't know, a mile and a half from town. And now they have it really nice so the tourists can walk and, of course, ride bikes or whatever. And of course, with summer like we had last year, you can see why they want to do that. And they said we really should have communicated more and often with the locals. Even if they disagree, listen to them and stress positive outcomes. Okay, again, more training so that everybody can be successful and get a piece of the pie. But this was something I thought was interesting, is that the Native culture is embraced more by the community and the youth, even the babies. And the Native community, so many of us are shy, not me of course, but but they feel good about themselves because they have a good job and they make a good wage, and the tourists love to hear the stories about their culture and who they are and subsistence and all that kind of stuff. Expect lots of outsiders, but not all of them will stay. Many will just come to work and then leave. Lots more opportunities for youth. Families stay in Huda instead of leaving, which is nice. I mean, if you imagine, like I know my daughters, I don't want them to all leave, and then I won't have them around. And if I want to go see my grandbabies and whatnot, I want to have them all live where I live, right? And everybody wants that. So this way, you know, the college kids come home and they have something to do, they can make some money, and then come back and make their own business or work for ISP or another company. Housing issues are still a problem. They had to bring in, they built a lot of small cabins. They even brought in an old bunkhouse from Whitestone Logging. And they even brought in Connex vans and put beds in them so people can rent them with a list of beds to sleep in. And then of course there's lots of couch surfing going on at first until everybody finds a place. And the city has sold and keeps selling more lots for new construction, so that's really been an uptick in construction in Huna. It really is growing a lot. How were negative impacts overcome? Again, you know, the housing continues to be a challenge, but people are working on it slowly. It's definitely better than it was. There was a huge, you may have heard about, local disagreement over the location of the new cruise ship dock, and which led to a lot of divisiveness within the town. And then they lost $7 million in grant money because of it, and so Huna told them had to borrow the money, and so they were disappointed about that. And then the communication helped, but it took time and a lot of patience. And then I was curious about whether it helped, you know, reduce costs or added costs for people there. They said the cost of groceries is high, but it's always been high. People still go to Juneau and the ferry, when they have a ferry, to shop at Costco, whatever. I think people here do too. They said the cost of airfare to and from Huna increased, but it might have anyway. Cost of water and sewer increased about 12%, but again, it might have anyway. The price of boat moorage in Huna went up. Used to be a lot of people would go and leave their boats in Huna for the summer, and they stopped doing that because it's more expensive now, or they don't do it as much. And there's still no bank in Huna, go figure. I don't know why, but there isn't one. This is one thing that I was really fascinated by, that the city, they said 40% of their sales tax revenue now comes from ISP, directly. And then they can't really measure all of the extra sales taxes from the ancillary businesses that are also collecting more and paying to the city. So it's really helped the city just, you know, build their coffers and made it easier for them to provide a better quality of life for their residents. And I guess we're doing questions later, so thanks.
And true, we do have one more speaker and then a break to get some refreshments and then the big Q&A session. So we'll, I did have a question. Is there anyone here who's your first time to one of the forums? Just curious. Okay, and who's been to one before? All right. All right, well, let's bring up our final speaker for this afternoon. We have Shena from Hemmera coming up, and she's been managing projects and contributing to environmental assessments for 15 years now. She works closely with clients to ensure a thorough and robust environmental and socioeconomic effects assessment is delivered that meets their needs as well as expectations of First Nations and communities, assessors, and regulators. She has a Bachelor of Arts in Anthropology, focusing on First Nations studies and geography from the University of Victoria in Canada. Welcome, Shena Shah.
Thank you. Sorry, you'll have to pardon me. I lost my voice 2 days ago, so this might be painful for all of us. I will do my very best. So thank you very much for inviting me to come and speak. As Tara said, I live in Whitehorse. I grew up most of my life in Whitehorse. And I have also spent a lot of time working in Yellowknife, which is in the Northwest Territories. You may be familiar with Yellowknife ice road truckers, I think is a big thing there, but also that's where there was the big diamond mining boom in Canada about 20 years ago. So as was noted, I work in socioeconomic impact assessment. So I have had a number of clients, many proponents of projects, Indigenous governments, federal government, territorial government. And essentially what I do, is I facilitate a dialogue between people. And so I use my skills in facilitation and my experience to sort of make sure that there's an open, transparent communication between parties so that people can make decisions for themselves as to what they think about projects and then engage in regulatory processes. So, there we go. Socioeconomic, there isn't really like a universal definition of it, but it's often used in impact assessment, so that's why we've got a couple definitions up there. It's essentially just about people, how people interact with their environment, how they interact in their communities, and it's just about being human. We'll go to the next one. So there's probably people in the room far more experienced in NEPA than me, and I don't even know if I'm saying it right, maybe it's NEPA, but essentially environmental assessment kind of came out of the 70s, and so NEPA was actually a real groundbreaker for social impact assessment or socioeconomic impact assessment back in the 70s, and so it was required, a social impact assessment was required for large projects. Excuse me. In fact, little known statistic which I dug out was that the Bureau of Land Management had 45 social scientists on staff in 1970s. Social scientists being not the ones who study the rocks and the water and the wildlife, but the ones who study people. So there is some more definitions of socioeconomic impact assessment, again sometimes called social impact assessment or sociocultural impact assessment. And sometimes it's called impact assessment and sometimes it's called effect assessment. We just like to make things really confusing apparently. In BC, you guys will be familiar with your neighbors to the west, east. Sorry, normally I'm always saying about the west because we're in Western Canada, but I'm even further west now. In BC, they use the 5 pillars to assess projects. So the environment, it's just one of the 5 pillars. The other 4 pillars are economic, social, heritage, and health. And in the Yukon, I've got the definition of socioeconomic impact assessment there. But in the Yukon, our legislation is called the Environmental and Socioeconomic Impact Effect Assessment Act. And that's because the environment is treated equally with socioec, and socioec wasn't considered underneath the umbrella of environmental impact assessment. Okay. Just a second, I'm gonna get some water. We'll get there. So essentially the goal of socioeconomic impact assessment is to promote better outcomes. And it depends on where you're looking, but internationally, a lot of this work deals in countries like Africa and in South America, and so they're dealing with some things like relocation of entire villages, et cetera, so a lot of it has to do with human rights. And so that's why sometimes you'll see about equitable and sustainable development. Essentially, socioeconomic impact assessment is a tool to empower populations or communities to get engaged in the process of decision-making about projects. And so fundamental to socioeconomic impact assessment is that stakeholders, and I use the term really broadly, but basically anyone who is potentially impacted by a project has an avenue to get engaged in how this process works. Okay, so scoping. So there's essentially about 6 steps to an impact assessment process. And I'm not going to get into I'm not intending to try and get into the weeds around the legislation, because obviously your legislation is going to be different than that in Canada. But from a general practitioner perspective, this is all the steps that you would go through as you engage in socioeconomic impact assessments. So the first step is to scope out what the project is. And basically that gets you kind of the things that are most important. And so we would use a term like value component or something like that, but essentially it's to sort of identify all the key kind of things we want to look at when we're conducting a socioeconomic impact assessment. So for example, for a mine, it might be community well-being, if there's going to be an impact to a community. I'll get into some of the details on that later. And then the other piece about scoping is you have to decide where the potential effects might be. So generally they're, we create a study area. So essentially like a community like Haynes would be a study area. So we want to figure out what is going to get impacted and where it's going to get impacted. And then what we do is we identify a baseline of current conditions, so that kind of benchmark. We identify potential effects, and then we propose ways to mitigate. I'm going to get into more detail. I know it seems fast, but we'll get into more detail. We're going to figure out how to mitigate bad things or enhance good things. Then we define significance, and then we go through monitoring and adaptive management. So essentially the process is not there to decide if a project is good or bad. It's a tool for decision makers to kind of be able to lay everything out and sort of weigh the net benefits or the negatives of a project. Okay. So when I was talking about the scoping, we would identify a list of things that we think might be affected by a project. They could include community characteristics, land and resource use, community well-being. One of the ones that's used, I think, here in the States is the term called environmental justice. And so that's, making sure that negative impacts of a project are not disproportionate to marginalized populations, like people with lower income levels, things like that. Health is one, and there's a whole suite of things we could look at, and then we apply those to the study area, as I noted before. A baseline. I was just thinking I should hire Jodi and come work with me, because interviews are part of baseline. It's a good one, although I don't think I could be calling people from Arizona to get away from it. So the baseline is essentially your existing conditions. So it's what the community, how the community has of that that issue, say what's the status of healthcare in this community before the project goes ahead. So it sets a bit of a benchmark that you can then measure change against. And by primary and secondary research, what we do is we do things like interviews. So we go out, collect our own information, and then we of course also use information like statistics, reports from municipal governments, etc., etc. So then we get to the good stuff, which is the effect assessment or the impact assessment. And the thing about socioeconomics is that you are considering both the potential positive as well as the potential negative effects. And so we would go through that process of predicting effects based on the consultation that's done in the community, case study experience with other projects such as Red Dog, our own experience in jurisdictions, as well as professional judgment. So if you think about, the earlier definition that was provided around socioeconomic impact assessment, it's basically how it's going to impact people's day-to-day lives. I mean, that's a big ask, right? Obviously, projects can have both positive and negative impacts. So a lot of potential impacts have already been discussed today, and it's been really good. I'm going to have some examples I can draw on as well. So the positives are things like employment and contract opportunities, training opportunities, increased spending, all these have been discussed. One that wasn't mentioned was it was in your example of the tourism project, cultural revitalization. Projects can provide seed funding for big projects like hydro or transmission lines. Of course, negative effects. So economy is this double-edged sword, employment opportunities are a double-edged sword. When a big project gets built and a lot of people want to see a lot of jobs from it, you saw the stats, there's pretty high-paying jobs. So sometimes mines will open and they'll hire a lot of people away from local businesses, and then local businesses are left going, how am I supposed to compete with that wage? Like $100,000 a year, Or in some cases, jobs that don't require a lot of education or potential training. So sometimes cost of living will increase. There can be, as was noted, increased demand on housing. That's a big one in the north, I find. Increased crime, increased rates of STDs if you have a lot of influx of young workforce, family violence, fragmentation of family cohesiveness. So for the example of mines where there's a 2-in-2 rotation, where a partner is leaving their home community for 2 weeks to go work instead of driving in and out every day. Sometimes they'll go in for 2 weeks and out for 2 weeks. And that can have a lot of impacts on the home life as well. I've also talked to many, I'm not going to lie, wives who are like, that's great. I enjoy my 2 weeks off too. There's increased demand on municipal services. I mean, it's funny, we were talking about sewage treatment at lunch. You wouldn't believe the amount of discussion around sewage treatment in the north. Lots of people like to talk about poop. Lots of land for recreational and traditional use. I guess the thing about impact prediction and impact assessments is it's highly complex, and if you really think about it, the same impact can be both positive and negative depending on the individual and the choice they make. And so if you want to try and predict human behavior, I mean, good luck, right? In some respects. It's part science and part art. So, now that I've painted that picture for you, essentially we're not at a complete loss. There's lots of stuff that we can do because we have all these wonderful examples, like for example, Red Dog. So mitigation is a term that we use. It's basically something we apply in the defense assessment process to impact. So we're basically trying to prevent that bad thing from happening that we're predicting. So influx of, workers, and we think it's going to cause a problem with housing. Okay, a mitigation measure is the proponent will commit to, having camp at site instead of expecting employees to live in the community, for example, things like that. And there's a whole slew of things that we can pull from, and I guess this is one of the more exciting kind of areas to work in, because there's of course the tried and true mitigation measures that have been used for long time, 140 years of money. There's lots of things that have been done for a long time, but now we're really starting to get very creative and thinking outside the box, and proponents or companies that want to build big projects realize that this is going to be, if not is, the most important thing to try and advance their project, is making sure that there's community acceptance for it. And there won't be community acceptance unless they're doing a lot of really creative things to address the potential negative impacts. And then enhancements are applied to potential positive impacts. So if we already know that, there's going to be lots of good paying jobs, well, how can we make sure that those good paying jobs are going where we want them? Or, well, we know the proponent's going to increase training programs. Well, how do we make sure that people are staying in training programs and are graduating from those training programs? And so it's just trying to ensure that those positive benefits are actually happening. Can move on. Now, then so throughout an effects assessment process, you would have to kind of create a monitoring or adaptive management plan. I'm not really sure what the legislation requires here, but in the Yukon, the proponent has to file this with their effects assessment application, essentially. And it's sort of conceptual in nature, and then as they go through and get ready to start construction, then it has to be finalized. And essentially, the monitoring is essential. It's essential because it's about predicting human behavior in the future, and if you don't then monitor what happened, then it's sort of all for naught. And it's actually really the gap, because there isn't, while in the Yukon you're required to file a conceptual monitoring plan with your project application, there's no then legislative enforcement mechanism on the other end. So theoretically it could sit there and, anyways. So because it's there, I think the legislation and government policy sort of falling behind on this, what's happened is the communities and proponents have really stepped up and created other mechanisms to try and enforce this. And so you'll see a lot of these types of things get built into sort of agreements, either in the NWT, there's a 3-way agreement between the diamond mine, the indigenous group affected by the diamond mine, and the territorial government, which is equivalent to your state government. And that's essentially a contract that sets targets for employment and how they'll monitor things and how they'll manage things. With monitoring programs, obviously they need to include more than just the proponent. And I think that's why they've always sort of struggled to get really going, and that's because you need a lot of different people at the table. If you think about trying to monitor how a project will impact healthcare, it's not a proponent's responsibility to deliver healthcare to residents of a community. That's, well, in Canada it's the government's responsibility. I'm not really sure how it works here, so you can't get data to know if that monitoring, to know if that impact has happened. You need the government to be able to provide statistics for, say hospital visits of the elderly people having heart attacks when they get off the cruise ships, et cetera, et cetera. So it takes a lot of players, and I think that's why sometimes it struggles. And then there's no point in monitoring things unless you then change things that aren't working, right? So that's the adaptive management piece. The one really good example, again, I draw from my experience over in the NWT, but so the diamond mines had a local hire policy. Obviously, they wanted to hire a lot, and this was an area of the country where it's predominantly indigenous peoples, and so they had, there's no roads really anywhere. So they would fly folks in from the community into the Yellowknife, which is the capital city of the territory, and then they'd either have a stay over of one night, or they'd kind of fly out later that day, direct up to the mine site, because they were flying 737s to the mine. It was a big project. And after about a year, they realized that after their 2-week stint at site, some people were getting off the plane in Yellowknife and then not getting on that plane home to their community, and lo and behold, partners at home were going, where did the check go for the 2 weeks of work? And people were making poor decisions around how to spend their money with respect to, substance abuse. This is a really, really big problem. So it was something that they just hadn't anticipated. No one was maliciously thinking that this was going to occur. So there's a whole lot of things that can be done. There's obviously lots of drug and alcohol support systems that were put in place. But also one of the things is the company just said, well, we don't have to stop in Yellowknife. We can just charter smaller planes for the communities that we're hiring these half a dozen people from, and we'll take them direct to and from site. So we're thereby at least removing one enabling mechanism that was out there unnecessarily. So like a pretty simple fix. I mean, it doesn't address obviously many of the root kind of things that are going on, but it did allow the company to kind of then be able to report back to the community on things that they were doing to try and address these problems. So that's that. Okay, how am I doing for time? I'm totally lost track. Oh, lots of time, okay. I don't know if my throat's going to make it, but we'll go. Okay, so community engagement. This actually came up in Jodi's presentation as well. There was someone who was offensive and got bought out. Sounded really interesting to have been through that. So again, community engagement, early and often, is sort of the mantra. And that, I guess the whole reason around community engagement is to get back to one of the original goals of socioeconomic impact assessment. And that is that it's in part there to provide an avenue for communities to be engaged in the process of impact prediction, impact assessment. And so so like these forums, for example, is one way. And then as a project gets more defined, and we start to identify what that scoping stage, we'd be out in the community going, okay, how do you think this project's going to impact you? Where are those impacts going to be? We would be doing that with primary data and secondary data. As I noted before, primary data is that I myself am going and doing an interview and collecting data versus gathering data from somebody else who's already collected it. We then go and kind of summarize our findings, and then we go and report back to the community, and we say, here's where we're at so far, and kind of what we think the baseline of this issue is here. And I guess, there's workshops, there'd be community open houses, and in some cases, for bigger projects, you might want to do questionnaires and surveys. I mean, there's just a whole avenue of ways to kind of collect that stuff. And generally speaking, the level of effort you put into that kind of community engagement would be appropriate to the scale of the project. I work, or to the level of interest, I guess. I'm working right now on a really small project, but it's oil and gas exploration, so it's garnered a lot of interest, so the level of engagement is higher because that's what the community wants and needs. But essentially, I guess the point is you can't go and do this you can't summarize how a project's going to impact people without talking to those people. I mean, it seems pretty straightforward. That's what I got my university degree for. Okay, so in summary, I think I'm down to the wire here. So best practices for socio-ec, that deep and meaningful engagement throughout all stages of the process, as I described it before. Robust and defensible data. Like Lance said, you need good data, and good data isn't just numbers. Good data is qualitative, so that qualitative data means not numbers, it means talking to people. Careful consideration of recent experience and case studies, using things that are tried and true, as well as being creative and thinking outside the box. Making a really solid commitment to monitoring programs, and then obviously continual adaptive management. I made
Thanks, Shena. Shena Shaw with Hemmera. So we'll take a little break here, and I think refreshments are available over to your right. There's fresh air outside. Restrooms are through these doors here or downstairs. Meet everybody back here in 10 or 15, and we'll proceed with Q&A. We'll have the 3 speakers up here and have questions for them. Thanks.
Well, it's a completely fair question, and there's lots of meat there, and I'll try and stick to kind of our timeline. But I mean, it's a completely fair point. I guess alternatively, should the taxpayers pay for it, or should the community pay for it? I mean, I guess the cost of them bringing their project to market should be borne by them. So that's sort of the money piece, I guess, from my perspective. The objectivity piece, I mean, it's a completely fair point, and I really don't have anything to stand on other than my reputation. So the ability for me to work in my field for more than one project means that I have to remain objective. And so that's why I'm very clear with all of my clients, if they are mining proponents or oil and gas or whatever industry proponents, I've worked for governments as well, that I am facilitating that process. As I mentioned, I'm not part of their comms team. I want certainty of process, not certainty of outcome. So I'm not an advocate for them. But it's not black and white, and it'd be pretty ridiculous for me to stand up here and be like, well, I really don't care ever, because that's not true, right? Like, I live in the community of Whitehorse. I have clients that are trying to build projects in the Yukon. So, I mean, it's not an easy task, but it is, I guess that's my perspective on it. In the scenario where my report, so if I write up the baseline and the scoping study, and I go through all that, and then I file it with a regulatory board, essentially it's a arm's length, it's a non-government board, independent board, that then takes all of what I've created, or not created, but basically what I've written through the process that I've described earlier. And then they run a process where communities then get to file kind of their statements on a public registry system. And so then there's this kind of like mediated dialogue, I guess I would say, back and forth that this independent agency kind of runs. And sometimes communities don't typically hire consultants, but like First Nation government, for example, would hire their own kind of consultant to come in and sort of pick apart what I've done, and then we'd have this kind of little professional debate on the registry, and And that the whole purpose of environmental impact assessment, of which social impact assessment is a piece, the whole purpose is to sort of make projects better. So that if I haven't uncovered every stone, someone else can come in and be like, hey, like, you didn't look at this case study from Red Dog, and here's what they're doing there, and why don't you do that, or whatever. That's the purpose of the process. It's not really for me to kind of go in and say, oh, the project's, it should go ahead, or it shouldn't, it's good or it's bad. It's to be able to create the space for that back and forth, to kind of have then people, community members as well, at the end of that process can say, well, I know they've talked about everything, and there's what the mining company thinks, but I still think this way. You know, and that's not my jam. I just, you know, after that point, it's sort of like people make their own decisions, because there is no way I could kind of go through an entire process like this and say, oh, okay, well, this project's going to be good or bad, because everyone values things differently. All I'm trying to do is create the space where it's all out there so that people can kind of evaluate and weigh out, is there a net benefit here? Because you're never going to get rid of all the bad things. It's kind of impossible. It's just a process whereby people can kind of make that decision for themselves.
Thank you. We still have time for more questions. Who else has a question?
Any third-party consultant has a reputation, so I would say that if they don't do a good job on their assessment, then people are going to notice that and not hire them anymore.
Thank you, Jodi. Yeah.
I have a question for Jodi. You described the big new project in Huna. I'm just wondering, how does the economy of that project compare to the other things that are happening in Huna, like fishing? Is fishing a large part of Huna's economy? How does the new project compare to the number of dollars that come in from fishing?
You know, I don't know the numbers or the percentages, but there is still a very robust fishery going on in Huna. They still have their own seafood cold storage, I think is what it is. Bill, don't you deliver to them still? So they still have and Dip Dahl still comes to Juneau and sells his fish at Ogg Bay. So as far as I can tell, it's still really good. And then they do the fish charters as well, so it's kind of given more opportunity to the fishermen from what I can see.
Great. Next. Come on. What if I do a lap? Somebody? Well, then maybe we can ask the committee if they have any questions for the speakers, since they've been putting quite a bit of time into planning all of this. Anyone from the committee have questions?
I talk loud enough, I don't need that. So my question is for Shena. How much of your study looks at the closure and post-operation of a project, and what that effect is going to be on the adjoining or nearby communities, and what type of tools do you use to make sure that you can curb any major changes after the closure?
Thanks. Yeah. So that's actually a really good point to raise. It's kind of a bit of an emerging field. It typically hasn't been looked at much in the past, but there's a lot of focus on it now. And I can say personally, especially in the Yukon, it's of heightened concern, because basically every project that's ever gone in to operation is closed. So one of the things we're doing now is social closure planning, sort of one of the phrases that's often used. So in putting forward a project, a mining company will have to write a closure plan. And in the past, that closure plan has always included how they would shut down a mine from like an engineering and environmental perspective, and then monitor water quality and yada, 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 which is all very important, good stuff. And it didn't include anything like, okay, well, what about the people that are going to be losing their jobs? So now what we are starting to do is kind of like identify plans, kind of staged plans, right? You don't really need a lot of detail for closure planning at the outset of a project, because obviously that's 10 years away, and you have 10 years or 15 years or 30 years of learning about the workforce that you could do. But a lot of things that are typically considered as training, retraining programs, like sort of RSPs or things here, but essentially like pots of money for kind of at the end of the mine life that are kind of intended for kind of the workforce as they're leaving. There's actually been a bit of a push too recently in having projects staged, like Lance was sort of joking about, you know, all the workers from one mine getting hired by the other. And I can say that I've seen that sort of happen a little bit. Like it's sometimes definitely I've seen it more led by the community to have that phased approach to projects. And obviously the motivation of a company is to extract the resources. But I have seen scenarios where the projects will kind of go into play in an area in a phased manner to kind of reduce that burden on the workforce, because you know, we talk a lot about jobs and job creation, and that's great, but there's also a scenario in many northern communities where the available pool of employable people is essentially already tapped out. So why are you kind of keep beating your head against the wall in terms of local hire targets? So that's one thing. I don't know, do you have, Lance, some? I was going to put you on the spot.
Sure. No,
all right.
Yeah, I think that companies now are thinking about closure a lot more, not just the environmental side of closure, but you know, their legacy in an area, what kind of businesses can be left, because it's bad business to just leave and shut the doors and kind of leave the dishes on the table anymore, like used to happen. Because you know, companies are global, so they get a reputation just like consultants. So I think there's a lot more focus on post-closure, what is the legacy the company's going to leave in the community, and what's the economy there. So even to the extent of building, you know, other micro businesses or helping other businesses go. So that was one thought I had. And then, you know, I was thinking more about the discussion and mention of Greens Creek, and no doubt, I mean, there's closures, things happen, but in that case, Greens Creek has now been around 30 years going, and it looks like, you know, there's good life ahead. And I was also thinking back to the history of Juneau. When was the Depression? Like 30s? 29 till? 1939. So 10 years? A 10-year depression where people were in soup lines. And in Juneau, there were jobs. And people were coming to Juneau, and they were good jobs. So, you know, I think we can look at all these sides. I mean, that's a pretty big chunk of the United States history where Juneau was a place for good jobs, because that's when gold was 30 bucks, and I think the government raised it to 35 bucks an ounce or something. In 30. Well, it's $32 in 1932? Yeah, in those numbers, it's all of it. But point being, Juneau was operating during the Depression. So, you know, ideally in a community, you have enough industries and businesses so you can, you know, hopefully weather different storms. Diversification, I guess.
Great. Who's next? One in the back.
So this question is for all three of you. All of you have had experience in Whitehorse and through the communities, the smaller communities in Southeast, and Lance, your experience, Western Alaska and Juneau. What, from your experience, what positive steps can a community like Haines undertake to better understand the concerns and dynamics that all of the residents have about a potential mine, and what programs have you guys seen in the communities that you've worked with that you could advise us on?
Ask me all the tough ones. No, I think I think you guys have already done a survey, or somebody has thought about doing a survey, a community survey. But otherwise I don't really have any advice on that.
So that was a tough question, and Sue and I were joking about that. She was about to ask that too, but it is a good question. I think one thing is education, and forums, speakers, understanding the industry and the stage where this project, in your case, is at, and the expectations and chances of it going ahead, what it'll take to move it ahead. Not get expectations too high, because what I've seen in projects, if it's too high, then both people are all gung-ho about the project and people are against it, and it just ratchets up the conversation. So, I mean, understanding the process of the mineral exploration to development, the phases. And then I think it's another thing that we've had this conversation in the NANA region is, I just gave a presentation where I said, imagine Northwest Alaska in 2035, because Red Dog's scheduled to close in 2031. There's a lot of great opportunity. It should probably go decades longer, but that's kind of the bankable thing. So imagine this region in 2035 with no mining. So think of it that way. Think of, let's say there's no project at all here tomorrow. I mean, some people might be happy, but then what about those other hopes and dreams? So I guess I would think about, when you have an opportunity, how do you potentially take advantage of it? How can you leverage it? Even thinking outside the box, if that makes sense. Because when we've done that in the Northwest, it's kind of people like, whoa, it's sort of like, when you're playing with a toy and you don't use it for a while, and then the other neighborhood kids come around and want to play with it, and all of a sudden it's a little more valuable. So, I don't know, when you have opportunities, I guess maybe that's it. Just be creative about how you could benefit from it. Does that help a little bit? It's not a very straightforward answer, but on one sense, be thankful in this day and age you have, and from my perspective, I'm biased, but that there are these opportunities to think about that could help in some part sustain a community, provide jobs for young people, keep some grandkids around, things like that.
Still have time for a few more questions. Does anybody else have some?
Yeah, thank you, Norman Hughes. A little late to the show here, but the question I have is the impacts of a mine in Haines, the cost to the community, I'm talking dollars. What's the general model? Do mines pay ahead, or do they pay as they go because there's community impacts? I feel that, and with the state, these days with the state and not much money, we're fortunate we have a new port facility, we're rebuilding a dock out Lutak, but we need more money for that. we've got the school that we're making payments on, but we upgraded it, it could take more capacity, you know, new highway being put in stages. But that money all came from somewhere else. And mine comes in, the borough's gonna have to pony up for having services, whether it's ambulance, police, library enhancements, pool, school. I can't even think of all the possible things. And that takes money. Immediately takes money. Is there a model for mines paying ahead to help with that? Or do they just kind of pay as they go depending on the municipality or the tax structure? I'm just curious if there's a model for paying ahead to help ease communities into it so there's more buy-in to the community from the mine. Thank you.
A few ideas is not really ahead, because when you don't have a project yet, you can't. But I'm not too familiar with Nevada, but I know they have some local county taxes, and there's some scaling there for impact, increased students in school, medical services, things like that. So there are some models around. In Northwest Alaska, the payment in lieu of taxes, that's a negotiated thing. And it's important, again, to have these discussions early, because if the community says, oh, this is what we think the cost is going to be, and that cost is whatever. Let's say the operators, the proponents think it's too high, then you just won't have a project. Or not even they think it's too high. I guess what I'm trying to say is there's a case in Northwest Alaska where it came to a lawsuit between Tech and the borough, where if the severance tax went through, it would have made the mine uneconomic, period. So that's the other kind of balance. But answer maybe your question is, yes, there are. I'd look at Nevada, and you have to really look at the costs. What are the true costs? Because the mine, all companies are willing to cover those increased costs, but not everything that often gets added on, if that makes sense. But sure, that's what a project will, is companies want to work with the community, not so there's extra burden on the community. That helps.
Jodi, Shena, this might be your territory too, if you can.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I'm not sure if you were here, I was going to ask the question, that in Hoona with the ISP, they're now, just with their sales tax from sales and tours and whatnot at ISP, now provide 40% of the sales taxes for Hoona. And that's not including all the ancillary businesses and other sales tax collectors that provide that revenue to the city. So they've had to make new investments, but it seems to me, like I said earlier, I don't know if you were here, they said that they had to do a new wastewater treatment plant and it was going to be $11.9 million, but they didn't seem to be concerned about having the money to pay for it. So they didn't say that.
I think there's just 2 points I was going to make. One is, Lance kind of alluded to it, but I think it's a really important point, and that is that mines typically are not generating revenue until they've been operating for 3, 4, it depends, a bunch of years. And so if you think about all the exploration that they go through, and then the construction phase, and then the into operation, they're not generating revenue for all of that time. So to put an extra cost burden at some earlier stage, it's very difficult now for a big major player like a Tech or some of these other huge companies. They might be able to consider something like that. But if you're looking at like a small independent or a more junior company, there just simply isn't the funding. And the only other point, and yes, there's lots of economic models to look at, and I'm not an economist, so I would not want to spew off too many things about that, but the other thing to remember, and it kind of gets to the boom and bust concept, is that mining companies are not government. And so if you, as a community, defer too much to a company to kind of, if you lean on them too heavily to support that, support things like infrastructure projects, transportation projects, health and education, they will go away. I mean, even big, long life mines eventually will go away, and more often the mine eventually will go away, and hopefully in a very planned and sustained manner. But you don't want to have a scenario where that mine was the only reason that your school was able to stay open or your healthcare facility was able to stay open, right? So you kind of want to balance that need and desire, and I think, like Lance said, I don't want to speak for mining companies, but yeah, sure, they want to pay their share, but they're also not in the business of government offering services like that, right? So it's a delicate kind of balance to kind of keep in mind.
Yeah, and thinking of, let's see, as far as the other, well, I was thinking about this, and it hasn't happened maybe as recently, but I know it used to be communities down south would pay money and have all kinds of incentives for, a car manufacturer to come into their community and all these things. And it strikes me as interesting is when a community has a mineral deposit in their backyard, very rarely, sometimes they do, but very rarely do they go out and market that. Instead, if a company comes in because there's a mineral deposit, then the community's like, what can I get out of it? So if you think about in that paradigm, I think it's kind of fascinating sometimes where as much effort as communities have gone into to attract a business to come to their community just for the jobs. And sometimes those businesses only last a few years in the case of a car manufacturer or something. So just throwing that out as kind of another idea. And then ideally the jobs will also, more people, then you have a tax base. And then infrastructure, and that's a big one too, like in the case of the North Slope, even the payment in lieu of taxes, somewhat that is based on the tax. So mine goes in, it's a pretty high capital cost, you have that investment, and then you can tax that. Like I mentioned earlier, Juneau, the largest combined taxpayer are the mines in the city and borough of Juneau for property tax.
So in the last 30, 40 years at least, and then prior to that too, mining has such a negative stigma, mostly I think because of fear and history. What is modern mining? How has that changed in the last 30, 40 years? Do you see that going in a positive direction?
It has, and I was also talking about that with some folks and with Sue. Let's see, the short story is, yes, it's gotten better because we know more about the environment. We know more about the legacies, the problems that have happened that just weren't done before. And that doesn't go for mining, that goes for how humans have lived on the earth. Whether it's taking fish and game or polluting, we're all getting just more cognizant of the world we live in. In addition, I think a big thing, 30, 40 years, and you had on your slide NEPA, that was a game changer. There's a lot of things at the federal level and now at the state levels that are regulated to, look after these environmental issues. Having said that, also we all have to think of, what we're doing today, what are the things we're all collectively doing today that in another 50 years we'll go, oh my gosh, I can't believe we did that. Probably drinking out of these bad, and all. Right? So that's another thought too. But the short answer is, yeah, the mining industry has really, it's changed. Red Dog, since it's public information, the bond for closure is $558 million. We're paying on that for closure and reclamation. So that's just another example. Old mines that you see, you know, around Colorado or wherever didn't have that. AJ didn't have that. Don't have to worry about AJ because the geochemistry of that deposit didn't matter anyways, but that's another story. So hope that helps.
Were there any other questions from the committee? Because we've got more from the audience too. Let me just take another one here, and then we'll open it back up to some audience questions. Hi there, Liz Corneo here with Constantine on the committee. I was wondering if all of the speakers could maybe think of a story, a case study, where it's often talked about what's the company's role, what's the government's role, but just talk about maybe what's been the community's role in your experience as an average community member. How do they engage in that conversation, whether to enhance a positive benefit or reduce a negative impact through meetings, dialogue, letters? What's been the mechanism that's maybe been successful at maximizing those benefits, minimizing the impacts, and making a more positive outcome?
I'll start at once now. Well, you're here, so that's step one. And continuing to do things of this nature, these kinds of events, and showing up. And then, depending on how the mining company kind of creates avenues for you to get engaged, that's another one. And then I'm a little out of my field in terms of the legislative environment here, but in terms of getting involved in processes as a project kind of applies.
So the question again is how to stories of engagement, basically.
Yeah, I think community involvement
Yeah.
and how community can participate in the process.
Yeah, it is well, it's becoming, it is happening here. Forums, asking people, studying yourself. What we found is often just the informal meetings are one of the best ways. Because if you get too many talking heads and presentations, people glaze over. So I think, as you know, was mentioned, early and often for that engagement. So maybe even shorter little programs for education. Also in the schools, I'd say, in the grade school and high school, having programs. There's things like ARE that are quite good for getting stuff, because then that also gets the parents engaged as well. Is that? I'm trying to think.
I don't have anything to offer because I wasn't actually in Luna when all of those discussions were going on and at the pre-development phase, so sorry, I don't really have much to offer on that.
Okay, we have 3 audience questions here lined up. One is here and then you guys. And then we'll start to wrap it up. Hit the snack bar one more time and get going. There you go.
Perhaps you could give us a couple of mines that did a successful closure, cleaned up after themselves and so forth. They're similar to the one we're going to have here, and that would be an example we could look at. Think of as an objective.
Think of? One last thing,
I don't know. Just to clarify, I don't think everyone got the question. It was an example of a mine that did have a cleanup plan after closure. And followed through with it.
Yeah, no, it's you got one? Well, there's one in the Yukon. I can, a couple in the Yukon. Obviously, we have some really bad examples where it didn't go right, such as Faro, which you may or may not have heard of, but it's a legacy project. But there was also Brewery Creek, was a gold project just outside of Dawson City. It was a cyanide heap leach facility. So I know that scares a lot of people when you throw around the word cyanide. It was cleaned up successfully. And we have a project, Minto mine is actually in the closure phase right now. So not, completely successfully closed, but it's being closed currently, and as far as I understand, it's going as planned.
I've got a list, yeah. One here, Fairbanks near Fort Knox, called True North. That's been reclaimed. It's kind of back to grassland and forest. Grouse Creek in Idaho, I mean, there are several. That was actually had some problems, and it's been reclaimed. Another one I was just looking at about a year ago from afar in Montana Tunnels, and that's kind of looks like Montana brown grassland now. Then the community in the mine, they put up some windmills for renewable energy near it. So there's a couple. Yeah. I mean, there are lots, but yeah.
Jodi, do you want to weigh in again, or are you just holding it for now?
Yeah, I'm just passing it
Just the middle, right. Vice manager, got it. We have 2 questions here.
Mine's for, for Jodi. One of the complaints afterwards on the 15 questions you had was there wasn't enough housing to begin with, at first. People were sleeping on couches. But with a mine, and maybe it's a question for all 3 of you, in this phase, do you really do you build now or do you wait? It's like, is it a field of dreams where you build and hope they show up, or do you wait and do the growing pains like Huna did?
I'm really not sure, but, Huna's been growing for a long time now, so, and they just continue to grow. And it seems like even from going there when I was a teenager that it's just gotten bigger and bigger. But I know that they're still working on that. In fact, they were making a lot of suggestions about who should build an apartment building, or who, Sealaska should do this and fix that, and of course we don't do that. So, but anyway, I'm sorry, I don't know. I would wait till I know for sure it's a go.
So if you're talking about housing for workers on site at camp, that would go ahead until the mine got an investment decision and got all their permits. I can speak to some experiences in Yukon where the community and the Economic Development Corporation for First Nation consider there's a mine that is in the process of going through getting their permits, and so they consider that a good enough kind of reason for investment, and that's a business opportunity for that community that they have then entered into agreements with the mining proponent, where the mining proponent has sort of basically guaranteed a certain amount of rental in terms of the need of the housing, and then the business development corporations are sort of investing the upfront capital costs, and that's offsetting sort of the risk for them because the proponent has guaranteed a certain number of beds, like people per year or whatever. I don't know all the details. So that's one loan.
Yeah, for building housing, I'd wait. Again, you'll have time, and once it gets to that stage, it's looking good, and then you'll get into permitting, and then, yes, with construction, and in a place like this, you'll be able to do that. And it would be a business opportunity, but you wait, you'll have time. And being engaged, you'll know more. And back to that question, there's so many resources out there. I mean, even the Constantine website, I know you have the community page, which is great, but there's just so much information, of course, available, and happy to answer questions anytime too.
Yeah, and we do have an opportunity to talk more one-on-one in just a moment. Did you have a question? Okay, one more question, and then we'll move on to the next section.
Lance, I'm familiar with the AIDA, Alaska Industrial Development Export Authority. I know that they invested in the Red Dog mine in Nana, tried to buy it back, and the state said no because, what, you can tell people what happened.
Yeah. Well, okay, yep. Nana didn't. Actually, we were trying to work with the borough to help them buy it back so there'd be income there. So the story in Ada, the total money they lent was on the order of $300 million in 2 different tranches. And they've been paid back twice now. The interest rate is still pretty high, and based upon the trucking fees and the port tonnage fees, the state of, through Ada, the state gets on the order of 20 to 25 million a year from Red Dog. So it has really been a cash cow. As Bill Sheffield said once in Willie Hensley's class, he goes, Ada didn't build Red Dog built Ada. So it's been huge. But they needed it because at the time, Cominco had enough money to buy to build rather the mine, but just not enough to capitalize the port and road. So it did work. So yeah, why Ada was reluctant to get rid of it is because it's so important for Ada. Yeah. They could. Yeah. Yeah. That's been one of Ada's best investments, I understand. Yeah, and Skagway. Yeah. So the mining stuff is paid for Ada, has been good for Ada.
Great. Thank you, everybody, for your amazing questions. And huge thanks to Lance Miller, Nana Corporation, Jodi Mitchell, IPEC, and Shena Shaw, Hemmera. So you guys should know there's still a little bit left tonight, about 20 more minutes just to mingle. There may be more questions that you weren't able to ask, or you might want to just ask privately. The committee also invites you to stay for snacks and refreshments here, get another go with the snacks, and use this opportunity to continue discussing the info with your neighbors and the speakers. And before that, the committee also wants to make a few last announcements. You guys can hang out just a second. The key objective of the committee is to organize public meetings, workshops, and events designed to increase awareness and foster an atmosphere of respect and facilitate constructive dialogue. And to focus on the topics of science, community, socioeconomics, and process. And you're still here. So we hope that's what's been happening tonight. There are forms in the back too. As you guys go ahead and start to mingle, I'm going to keep on talking. There's forms in the back that you guys can use for feedback. You can also send any comments to anyone in the group. Just grab them and get their contact info. And you know that there's quite a bit of money that goes into putting these on, so if anybody is so inclined to pitch in, go right ahead. I'm trying to keep it free for the public. And do also know that we have 2 other special guests here, 3, make that 3. Bureau of Land Management has James Whitlock and Rick Tankersley here, and Mental Health Trust has Mike Frazier here. So grab them if you need to. Thank you, everybody.